Alex Padilla is dead weight. He has done nothing.
To be fair, Congress hasn't done shit except for deal with the impeachment all week. All the points that I have are people voting yes on the resolution to impeach, and random articles saying, "Oh no, AOC is a socialist. We're all gonna die."
Welcome back to The Left Field, where four friends gathered together to discuss their fantasy Congress League and what the Democrats are up to in Congress from a leftist perspective. I'm Alexi Jenkins.
I'm Luis Pagan.
I'm Talan Nabale.
I'm Himanshu Pandey.
So, impeachment.
God, again? We're still dealing with this?
Jamie Raskin cried, that's all I know. He cried and didn't get points for it. That's all I know.
That's all that matters.
There should be a point bonus for crying.
So I have a hilarious thing to talk about that Trump's defense lawyers did. So most of the points on my team this week came from Trump's defense lawyers playing videos of statements that Democratic House members and senators had said about Trump. So they made this whole argument, first of all, that Democrats have made public statements saying that they would vote to convict Trump in an impeachment trial before the trial actually happened. So it was violating his due process. And then they played like videos of AOC and other squad members talking about how they would vote to impeach Trump. And then they did the most insane thing ever. So let's see, I wrote it down because it's like really funny. So they pulled a bunch of out of context quotes by a bunch of Democrats for the next section. And then they said, hatred, animosity, division, political gain. For House Democrats, Trump is the best enemy to attack. That same hatred and anger has led House managers to ignore their own words and actions and set a dangerous double standard. And then they pulled these quotes. So they did a bunch from my team members that I'll point out because they're hilarious. So they put a video of Ayanna Pressley saying, there needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there is unrest in our lives, clearly referencing BLM protests. Then Ed Markey, we have these battles on the floor of the Senate. I'm going to go down and battle. I'm going to be there on the floor fighting, clearly fighting for legislation. Then Padilla's quote was, you've got to be fierce in fighting. Tina Smith, proud to have been fighting. And then the quote they did from Raphael Warnock is just fighting. And their point was that's the same as what Trump said to encourage the riot on the 6th. So I just thought that was funny as fuck.
Clearly, they're trying to arm the Democrats to fight the Republicans on the Senate floor. We're making this old school. Inciting
a civil war mid impeachment trial. What a great strategy.
So, it's funny. Didn't Mitch McConnell just go to the AP the other day and say that he was going to acquit Trump without hearing any of the trial?
Yep.
Wait, really?
Yeah, I think it came out yesterday.
So much for due process.
Right? Let's not listen to the trial. Let's just acquit the guy.
Yeah, wow. Plans acquittal vote. Setting stage for Trump to evade second impeachment. What a jackass.
Ted Cruz was meeting with Trump's impeachment lawyers, helping them plan their legal strategy, giving feedback on it in the middle of the trial in which he's a judge. So, Luis, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the implications of impeachment or acquittal. So do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just wanted to ask you guys, what do you think happens if they, well, first off, let's go with the most unlikely option. What if they actually convict the guy? What does that mean for our politics / what does it mean for the Republican Party?
Think if Trump is convicted, he would split with the Republican Party. So I've heard rumblings. Yeah, I've heard rumblings that he is thinking about breaking off and making his own party anyway, and how perfect for him that would be because he could hold rallies all the time. He would have to do literally no work, and he could just collect money from his supporters for not even pretending to do anything. So I think that that would happen if they voted to convict.
Please split the Republican Party. It needs to die.
Yeah, I would love that. That's like dream scenario.
Right. In Texas, I heard that the MAGA party was registered about 2 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. So from what I hear, it's already in the works.
That's exciting to hear.
That would be so if that actually happens, we get all the QAnon far right Republicans, like a good chunk of the Republican Party in Trump's party. Then we get a moderate Republican Party of the rest of the people, which is probably a smaller faction. And I think that party would probably be joined by some of the more conservative Democrats as well, to form like a new Republican Party. And then we can push to the left. So dream scenario.
Yeah, this is how the parties get formed, right? Historically, one party would push far in one direction, consolidate, and then the party that's actually further in the opposite direction comes to power.
So let's talk about the more likely, like currently happening scenario, and that like it seems like the Republican Party has largely not really changed from the Trump administration. If he doesn't get convicted, if he doesn't get impeached, do we see a like? I mean, we've already seen Marjorie Taylor Greene, or whatever her name is. I think it's that. Be not reprimanded at all by the Republican Party. I know there's a few people who have basically said like that's where the energy's at within the party. So there's an acknowledgement of that to a certain degree. Not to say that's like wholly incorrect, to be perfectly honest. Do we see them trying to like, and I honestly, this is the other thing that scares me the most is that like, it seems like most of like left media is like already ringing the bells on a Republican takeover 2022, 2024. They're almost like writing it on the wall for themselves, which I don't understand, to be perfectly honest. I really don't. I don't get it. I see where they're coming from. I just don't know why they're trying to push us in that direction almost, by just like admitting this early. But what do we think? What do we think is going to happen in the Republican Party if he doesn't get acquitted or if he doesn't get impeached?
Yeah, so I don't think that the leftist media is necessarily saying or pushing for the Republican takeover. I think just the opposite. They're completely they're warning us about it, and for good reason. So we had the what's it called? The census happened recently. So now there's going to be a bunch of redistricting. A lot of blue states are going to be losing House representatives, and a lot of red states are going to be gaining House representatives. I think the only blue state that is gaining a House rep is actually Oregon. Besides that, Texas is gaining a House seat. Arizona is gaining a House seat. And when you have such a small majority, what this means is that the Republicans could very well take over the House, not just the Senate, in 2022. If that happens, Democrats are going to be hamstrung, and they're not going to be able to do absolutely anything.
Yeah, the bottom line is we need really bold action. We've talked about this before on this podcast, but we need really bold action from Democrats. And I actually saw some really interesting reporting by NPR that top Democratic leadership might actually be recognizing this reality. So the story was about Schumer's ideology as of late. So last week, he actually did a press conference with a bunch of squad members, including some of the new squad members, all of whom are very progressive. And together, it was that group, it was Schumer, and it was Warren. And they all urged Biden to cancel $50,000 in student debt. And Waleed Shahid from Justice Democrats actually said that that's something that Schumer has never supported in his entire career. And especially coming from New York, like New York is seeing such a strong progressive front sweep in office. So I think it's possible that Schumer is picking up on that and being like, oh, I have to move farther. Like he's already moved farther on climate change as well. So it might be happening. It is a really big deal if Schumer does move farther to the left, because the Senate is kind of our biggest hurdle in terms of getting things passed. So we'll see whether it comes to pass or not. But that did give me a tiny glimmer of hope in my cold black heart.
Someone was randomly telling me that like Schumer, because ever since the election, Schumer has been like saying like very leftist things. Someone was telling me that he was afraid of AOC primarying her in 2022 or something.
Yeah, this NPR article actually did talk about the fact that progressives could primary Schumer. And it seems like that the specter of that is working.
Yeah, right. Even if the fact that like just the fear of that is pushing Schumer to the left is also shows you the power of progressives in government. You know, it's like being literally anywhere. But like, yeah, so I feel like we'll see. I personally I feel like everyone's like ring the bells on like a Republican takeover. I don't really know where that's coming from personally. Like I feel like the Republican Party has just like shown over and over again that they're just like awful people.
I mean, they got more votes. Like Trump got more votes this time around. Absolute number of votes, like he got way more votes. So I think when the Republican leans into like their hard right, bigoted bullshit, there are a lot of people in this country that does resonate with. I don't know. I just think that the whole tide that swept Trump into office, a big part of it was people being fucking racist, but also a lot of people being really frustrated with government not doing anything. And the Democratic Party in particular was pushed by Mitch McConnell to be the do nothing party because of how aggressively he blocked Obama's agenda. But the Democrats have really leaned into that and not fought back and just been kind of like, this is how the system works. We're okay with it. So if they keep doing that, nothing is going to happen in these 2 years. And if nothing happens, people are going to say, we voted for you, Biden, even though we had no interest in like what you were offering, and that got us nothing. So we might as well elect somebody who will, quote unquote, shake up the system like Trump was supposed to do to get us like somewhere.
Personally, nothing is so much better than what we had before. I would rather nothing happen than us actively move in the opposite direction. You know, it's like,
sure, but you and we are privileged that we're comfortable. For the people that are, getting evicted right now, even though the CDC is giving eviction moratorium guidelines, they're gonna get frustrated with the system. What's the point of electing the Democrats if, another week has passed without any stimulus checks? People are still getting evicted.
And that doesn't necessarily mean voting for the Republican candidate. That can just mean not showing up for the Democratic candidate, because the case was really made like, hey, Black voters, we need you. You have to turn out to save us from Trump. And when Black voters and like progressive activists who are Black in particular, we're trying to push for more like, hey, you've been denying us all these things we've been asking for, like good jobs, like civil rights, that we've been asking for since the time of MLK, saying it's not the time, you have to be patient, we need incremental change. So I got the sense that with this election, a lot of those voters were saying, okay, we're with you this time, but you have to pay up, especially with the Black Lives Matter protests. It's like, how long can the liberal elite say, keep waiting, it's not the time yet, until people get extremely fed up with that message? It's already been like decades, at least 50 years that's been the party line.
I'm totally fine to see the Democratic Party collapse. I mean, I think even like in 2022, 2024, I don't see the progressive drumbeat getting any like quieter. Like I think progressives will continue to gain seats. Even if that means a Republican takeover, like I'm honestly like, I mean, it's bad. It's obviously bad, but like I think Democrats will continue, or progressives will continue to like chip away at territory.
I mean, if there's that takeover, the progressives won't be able to do anything.
They aren't able to do anything now because of Democrats. It's like, and if those Democrats fall, then, honestly, like I would prefer I don't know how many places where like it's flipped from Republican to progressive, Typically, it does go from like Democrat to progressive, but like hopefully we can take some of that energy that is being channeled, that is like Democrats aren't doing anything, and like actually make some sort of division between leftists and Democrats and be like, yes, they're not doing anything. We're the answer to that problem, not Republicans. Like, turn out for us.
I'm sorry, man. This is like a colossally bad take. Basically, what you're advocating for is splintering our party, which is what we're trying to convince the Republicans to do. So they lose all the elections. Like, if we do that and they don't, we lose all the elections. Do you know what I'm saying? And like, if it's really, I really think it's do or die right now, because if Republicans get back in power, we saw everything that happened with Trump. Like, Trump did extreme damage to our system that I'm not sure we'll ever recover from. Like, it's not like Biden's in, everything's like okay now. Everything is not okay. Like, we are a very fragile democracy right now. And if the Republicans get in again, I do not think our democracy will survive, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think something you were mentioning earlier is that we typically go from Democrat to progressive. That's entirely true. I mean, look at what's happened in New York with a lot of these old school Democrat districts switching to progressive Justice Democrats. That's not going to happen if Republicans are in power, because they're not going to allow it to happen. I mean, think of all the voter suppression that happened under Trump and is still happening to this day. Republicans in Georgia are pushing for voter suppression like crazy because they're afraid of what happens when everyone is given a voice. If we allow Republicans to take over again, none of those voices are going to be heard.
So the Republican state government in Georgia is actually investigating the New Georgia Project. So for
What?
Yeah. So for those of us who are not from Georgia, the New Georgia Project is a voting access project. I believe it's completely nonpartisan, if I'm correct, and they register voters. So the Republican government is investigating them for apparently slowly submitting 1,200 ballot applications in 2019.
Sorry, we want people to vote.
That's absurd.
A lot of fuckery is happening when Republicans are in charge of the government.
Yeah, the only way I see the Democratic Party pushing left is them realizing they have to push left, a la Schumer, starting to push for climate reform. And if we splinter our party in that process, they're not going to be able to go left anymore.
Yeah. What I was hoping to see was more of like force the vote. I don't know if you guys followed that movement for a hot second, but the idea was to force everybody in the House to vote on Medicare for all. Just introduce it, put those people on paper where they lie on progressive ideals and demands, right? Medicare for all, of course, is like the direction we want to head in, and it's perhaps not like the perfect solution, but it's like the North Star to go towards. And to basically just vote against that, you're kind of saying that, hey, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but I don't want you to have healthcare, right? And you basically put all of the corporate Democrats on there, you put all the Republicans on there as well. But from a progressive standpoint, like Medicare for all has something like 70% support amongst Democrats and Republicans. So they'd very clearly be able to see, hey, your state rep didn't vote for Medicare for all. Are you going to support this guy or the other guy who did, right? So that was supposed to be like a sort of like a rallying point for progressives, but I think AOC and like the squad have unfortunately backed out from it because they had the ability to, and then they just decided not to. Obviously because of other strings being pulled behind the curtains, I'm sure, but yeah, it's kind of sad to see because I was really hoping that was going to happen because that to me is just like a massive step forward, just putting people, like putting it in the public eye, who stands where on the board. Right now, everyone's like, oh yeah, I'm a progressive, except for all these caveats and nuances. I am for better healthcare. I'm for better education, right? Those are all vague terms, but nobody really puts their money where their mouth is when it comes to like putting pencil to the paper. So
we definitely have a culture of not holding people accountable for their positions that they put out there. I mean, at least with regards to the filibuster, you don't ever have to vote on anything because the Republicans will get in the way of it. But if Pelosi doesn't bring anything to the floor and no one gets to vote on it, all we have is this nebulous amount of people that have signed on to bills that could very well not actually vote for that when, like you were saying, like when it actually comes to the floor, when people are actually made to put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, Pramila Jayapal actually spoke on this because, like we mentioned before, she's the head of the Progressive Caucus, and she was opposed to it as well because she was saying, there's no point, you're just going to lose votes of people who'd actually signed on. And personally, I think that's a really bad strategy. It shows that the progressives are playing the in-person, like rep to rep type of politics instead of doing externally facing politics where you really apply people power and pressure from constituents to reps. And I think that's the only place where change can come from, because the inner machinations of the system have not gotten us anywhere,
Change only comes from the bottom on up. Great man Bernie Sanders once said that.
And I mean, you see it happening all over the US. Right now, I think Reclaim the Block is putting forward a petition to establish a new Department of Public Safety in Minneapolis to basically sideline the police and introduce people with mental health expertise to sort of help out people that need that help. That's a massive change, and that's happened in the span of a year.
That's amazing.
That's really good to hear.
So we need a way to hold our reps accountable. First off, we need to be aware about what they actually believe. It's so easy to sign on to a bill. It's very easy to join the Progressive Caucus. There's no requirement. You can just sign on and say, oh yeah, I'm progressive too. And if we don't have a way to hold people accountable, we won't know who to call up and yell at.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, when you say $2,000 checks and you don't mean it, that's a pretty big one.
Yeah, exactly.
AOC actually tweeted calling that out as well. You can't promise people $200 checks and be like, oh, but it's going to be $1,400 and $600 with a new administration and all this
and
stuff.
Then carry the one. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because now Biden's getting pressure from the Georgia Democrats, from what I'm hearing, is because they're like, hey, we promised $2,000 checks. We campaigned on this. It's kind of up to you to deliver on this so we don't look bad on our word and lose our seats because of that the next time around. So that's also kind of good to see, but who knows?
I don't know why we're trusting establishment Democrats at all to keep their word. It's not like they've been doing so for the last however many years.
We're not. That's why all of the leftist outlets are saying that you're going to lose in 2 years.
I mean, I think in terms of the whole party splintering, I think it's already happened. I don't see there being a really unified Democratic Party. I think it's pretty overt at this stage.
All that matters is if you can vote together on legislation. And we are seeing progressive ideals permeate some of the more establishment Democrat policies. There's a resolution that Ed Markey introduced recently, which talks about it doesn't do anything, but it talks about a commitment to climate justice, racial justice, really supporting labor unions and low income communities that Cory Booker is signed on to, there are a lot of the establishment Democrats in the Senate signed on to it, and that's new. And I think the discussion about environmental justice specifically and racial justice as an environmental justice issue being something that's part of the mainstream Democratic Party discourse is very new as well. And that's something that even Biden has talked about. So Rashida Tlaib actually kind of praised Biden's climate plan and pointed out the fact that a lot of Green New Deal asks are in that plan, even though he won't use the phrase Green New Deal because Democrats are afraid of Fox News. But apparently in there is a promise that 40% of clean energy investment will be in frontline communities, which means low-income communities of color who are on, obviously, the front lines of climate change. So that is very, very, very new to mainstream party discourse, especially for somebody like Biden.
He really has the most progressive let's say, set of ideals that we've seen so far in a president, but that's only because the Progressive Party is holding his feet to the fire.
I think it's a matter of survival. Like, I mean, at this stage, it's one of those, like, I mean, climate change is like, it, you know, it affects Biden.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
But like even political survival, you know, like it's these ideas, the populist ideas from both the right and left are like still there. I think it'd be interesting for the progressives to like divert their energy towards flipping red House seats specifically, kind of like reclaiming our foothold in the House, especially if we're going to lose seats. But I think the Democrats will eventually play along. I don't think they have a choice, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I mean, it have to get to the point where the political calculus is it's more costly to come out against progressive issues than it is costly to do the opposite and pocket the donations from oil and gas producers and from big banks. Like the political pressure from the left and from the people has to be so overwhelming that those millions of dollars are no longer tempting, which is a big ask.
That's a huge ask, yeah.
And Chandan, I think that you're right that we need to start focusing on flipping red seats, but it's difficult with gerrymandering, and it's difficult with so many of these states being entirely controlled by Republicans.
Well, I think the interesting thing about the progressive movement is that I see actually a lot more corollaries between the progressive left and the like populist right. Like I think there are a lot of elements that are similar, oddly enough, like of anti-establishment, of like anti like money in politics, of these, you know, big whales as they call them, or rhinos, whatever.
On the right, that's a false front because a lot of the like populist right movements are actually paid for and instigated by super rich right-wing people. Like the Koch brothers funded the Tea Party, you know? So I think the right like is really good at picking up pieces of truth and then spinning them in a way that like furthers their own agenda. So they know that it's a good look to be a grassroots movement, but they don't actually have the support out there, like in the streets, like the left does. So they need to manufacture it. They need to pay people to go to protests in different states. They need to pay people to go to Trump's rallies and stuff. Like, so I think the rhetoric can be the same sometimes, but in terms of actual like viable movement issues, the right is pretty hollow.
Yeah, but I see what you're saying, Chandan, at least with regards to the tactics that need to take place, the grassroots tactics that need to take place from the left. We need to be maybe not storming the state houses, but we need to be out there, you know, protesting every single time that, you know, some bullshit comes in that's brought in by moneyed interests.
Yeah, because I think there's definitely marginalized communities that are deep red, a lot of marginalized communities that are deep red that like would obviously like largely benefit from leftist policies. And I think if we can encourage the splintering on the right to where instead of them splintering right, they just splinter progress. I mean, you know, it's like one of those things where like we just encourage them to leave the Republican Party, and there's already a energy there for those like hardline Trump supporters to do that. I think there's an opportunity there for sure, but I feel like Democrat or progressives are focusing a bit too much on combating the establishment versus like, because I think flipping red is mutually beneficial to both the establishment party and progressives.
Yeah.
That could also be the work from ours too, you know, like we live in red states. Well, we're currently in red.
Blue.
Former red state.
But I think literally even in New York, you know, like a lot of upstate New York is very red. Like every single state has their red pockets. But we're not there, you know, we're all in the urban areas. We're not at their doors. We're not in their communities. Like, I think focusing our energy in those areas could build up a huge amount of political capital for the progressive movement.
I don't know. I lived in one of those areas and like, I think people underestimate the racism and the amount of Fox News eroding people's brains that there is to be combated, because it's real. The community I grew up in is like really bad.
I think the only way that it actually gets combated though is by, this is like a huge ask, but like Democrats actually doing the right thing and passing these progressive legislation. Again, huge ask. But you know, if again, $2,000 checks, legitimately, if everyone saw $2,000 checks in their bank account, they'd be like, shit, okay, this is kind of better than where it was before. Like, and then like, you kind of like superset that racism with like, okay, but I did get $2,000, right?
Yeah.
And then you consistently deliver on those promises where they're like, okay, shit, like I do have better healthcare because of this administration, right? Oh, okay, cool. Maybe Black people aren't so bad, right? Like eventually you get to that point.
So I wanted to talk about a bill that was introduced back in January 4th by Mr. John Sarbanes, I think his 3rd congressional district of Baltimore, or of Maryland, in Baltimore. Anyway, one of the things we were talking about before was how do we switch people in red districts over to blue district. One of the main things that's getting in the way is voter suppression, but also funding for these candidates. HR 1, also known as the For the People Act of 2021, would restrict congressional gerrymandering, make it easier to vote in federal elections by creating an opt-out system so that, you know, anytime you go to update your driver's license or something like that, you're automatically registered to vote unless you opt out. And lastly, it'd be an overhaul of federal campaign finance laws. And the idea is that if you, as a congressional candidate, decide to not accept super PAC money or money from large corporations, only from individual voter or donors, the federal government will 6x match that donation so that people can start lobbying or start appealing to individual donors, and that carry way more weight. I mean, we've already seen that some people have been able to do that, like AOC and Bernie Sanders. But what this would do is make that a much more viable option and really allow for grassroots movements to take place. What are your thoughts?
So you're saying that this is a 6x funding match?
Yes.
That sounds pretty massive, because if I think of like going back to 2016, like imagine if Bernie in 2016 had 6x the amount of money that he did, right? Like 100% grassroots, like that's a blowout, right? It's like orders of magnitude of blowout.
Yeah, this was proposed in the House by John Sarbanes. I want to say he's been working on this since like 2006, 2008, when he first got into office.
So where does that money come from? I assume that like it's just like federally matched, or
it is federally matched. It's coming not just from taxes; it's actually coming from payouts from white collar crimes. So the idea is rich people who are, you know, having to pay back the government for doing whatever bullshit they did, they're taking that money and giving it to campaign finance groups.
Yeah, so I agree with that in theory, right? That makes a lot of sense. But what I'm wondering is, this is just me thinking like how this whole system works with like a 6x donation, and like you have an input of white collar crime, you have an output of 6x donations to political campaigns, right? Or political donations, excuse me. So essentially the funding dries up the more we regulate white collar crime. I'm just thinking about that, right? But again, you can source the funding from elsewhere. I'm just thinking out loud here, that's all. But yeah, that makes sense.
Well, I wonder how much of that is just held, how much of that is just held in a bank account, not doing anything.
It just seems like something that is like ready to be gamed, like I can just totally see someone on paper saying that they're like fully funded by grassroots donations, but like off the books, they're not.
How would that work? The whole point of the finance laws is to prevent anyone from accepting donations from these moneyed interests. And of course you have to declare who is funding you. You have to declare who your donors are, because any whiff they get of you accepting donations from large groups, you don't get those matching funds.
So the campaign finance is actually one of my pet issues. I did my senior project on it in college, but
Nice.
Basically, so I get really into this, but basically the FEC is the one who would be regulating it. They regulate it now. And there are reporting requirements in place right now. the big problem currently with campaign finance is the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which made corporations people for the purposes of campaign finance, and allowed like a large volume of donations to be funneled to candidates, particularly through like super PACs. And that is, I mean, there's no like black money, complete dark money going into these campaigns. Like there is a name of a super PAC on it somewhere. So you could just say, if you're not getting money from like individual constituents, then you don't qualify for this, for the matching. I think this is a good bill overall. Like I like it. It's not my like ideal solution to the problem, but I think it's pretty solid. If we could go further, what I would like to see is an extreme restriction on our campaigning cycle to make it very much more cheap and much shorter, because a lot of people in America get election fatigue. So France actually has a system where campaigning is extremely limited. I think it's like a week or a couple of weeks when you're allowed to campaign. Each candidate gets the same TV spots given to them. Each candidate gets like the same posters and like poster sizes that they can put up around the cities. So it's much fairer and it's much less about how much money that you can have. And I would just love to not see campaign videos on YouTube every 2 seconds for the year leading up to each election. I think it would be a huge reprieve for the American people to not have to be constantly bombarded with political advertisements, and instead maybe be able to focus their political energies on like actually paying attention to what their elected representatives are doing. So that would be more of my like dream solution, but I think this is a solid solution.
I think it's a very good step forward. And I think one of the main things I really love about this is, one, the opt-out system for registering to vote, but two, they also implementing same-day voter registration, putting in all these voter protections for, what's it called, interstate cross-checks, things like that. I think it's a big step forward to getting more people registered to vote. And I know that that's the number one concern that the Republicans have. So if they're concerned about it, I'm all for it.
So Georgia actually already has automatic voter registration through the Department of Driver Services, like this bill is proposing on a federal level, which is really amazing because there's 7.7 million registered voters in Georgia, 5 million of them registered through contact with the DDS. So it makes up a huge proportion of registration. The downside of that is that the Georgia General Assembly is currently in the process of trying to end automatic voter registration. So
Why?
this is like, oh, you know why. You know why. This is just like a micro level example of like what will happen on the federal level if Republicans are in federal power again. And it's completely indefensible because Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, I believe his name is Brad Raffensperger, he has actually touted this law as a big success when it comes to elections and election fairness. And his members of his party are the ones trying to undo it for purely partisan means.
Actually, so I wanted to also ask you guys a question, like between having like a big ticket legislation like Medicare for All pass versus having similar statutes pass, but in like a softer, more distributed means, like which do you guys feel like is more feasible?
Big ticket. Yeah, because I think your starting point is, you pick your starting point if you're the Democrats, and then the Republicans are going to whittle you down as far as they can. So if you pick a starting point that's already whittled down from what you actually want, what you actually get is going to be way less than that compromise that you initially offered. And we saw that with the ACA. There was a lot of discussion about Medicare for All at the time, but Obama chose to take an incrementalist approach to kind of play nice with Republicans while still getting something passed. And he got it passed, but it's been whittled down by Republicans and by the federal court specifically so much since he got it passed that it's not as strong of the program as the compromise program that he initially got passed during his tenure.
They could pass it. They could pass it tomorrow. They have the vote. I mean, they have the capability. They just choose not to. With omnibus bills, the problem is that you start engaging in horse trading, and and it gets nasty. It's like, okay, we'll reopen the Keystone Pipeline if you guys do this for Medicare for all. And it doesn't make us any better than the Republicans to make that attempt.
And who's going to get sold out first? It's going to be BIPOC, low income people. Like that, those programs are going to be the first ones to get traded away. Speaking of low income people of color getting their programs traded away, I wanted to talk this week about immigration.
Do you want to give some background into what's going on at the U.S. border right now? U.S.-Mexico border, not U.S.-Canada border. I mean, they're preventing us from going in there, but for good reason.
Yeah, so there is a lot going on with immigration generally. So currently, there are 25,000 migrants who have been waiting at the Mexican border for months to enter the U.S. to seek asylum. And just a little bit of background on asylum. So asylum is actually something that's codified in international law and provided in nations around the world. Like it's an obligation that every country owes and then applies through their own domestic law. So the Trump administration severely restricted asylum, which is really messed up because it's entirely on humanitarian grounds. You're eligible for asylum if you are persecuted based on certain protected categories like your sexual orientation, your national origin, your religion, your ethnicity, your race, your gender. So usually what you're supposed to do is let asylees come into your nation and then go through the process of applying for asylum. And that's how the American system has worked for a long time. So the Trump administration actually, I'm sure you guys will remember, instituted a policy a while back that kept all those migrants in Mexico. So the good news is that the new secretary, what's it called? The Department, Homeland Security Secretary.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mayorkas. He is actually the first Latino immigrant to lead the department. And he recently announced that they were going to allow those people to come through and stop holding them at the border. However, they haven't lifted the policy. So migrants who cross the border are still being removed under the Trump administration policy that aims to prevent the spread of coronavirus. And the Biden administration has actually said that their enforcement priorities are, first of all, migrants who are undocumented and commit crimes in the US, which has been like kind of the Democratic Party line for a long time, including under Obama. But he also said that migrants who entered the US recently were a priority for deportment. So anyone who entered the US from November 1st of 2020 to the present is the first to be deported. So, sorry, there's a lot of facts that I'm trying to lay down before we talk about this, but Biden actually tried to pause deportations for the first 100 days of his administration, but the state of Texas sued in federal court, and a federal judge temporarily blocked the move on January 26th. And during that time, ICE deported 900 Haitians, including dozens of children and pregnant women. And this is a really big deal because Haiti is incredibly unstable right now. They're in the midst of an alleged coup attempt, and lawmakers have come out in support of this, saying they were stunned at the swiftness in which the deportations happened. And a lot of Black lawmakers like Mondaire Jones, who's on my team, they've expressed concern that ICE's enforcement is particularly disproportionately targeting Black migrants from Latin America, who were already like a relatively small group compared to Latin Americans generally. And he said that his direct quote was, "ICE continues to be a rogue agency populated by people who share Donald Trump's racist ideology. White supremacy permeates the agency and it must be brought to heel." So he's come out against ICE. Ilhan Omar has renewed her calls to abolish ICE. So there is a lot of discussion about this topic. Biden's administration has already had a lot of tension with immigration activists. So apparently someone familiar with the Biden administration's transition team actually told NPR that they decided not to include immigration in Biden's top 4 priorities because they said that immigration activists were being too adversarial and that they were uncomfortable with the policies they were proposing. So that's where we are right now.
Yikes.
Yeah, I heard that I heard that ICE also accidentally, or maybe not accidentally, but they deported Haitians to Mexico.
Wow.
That's what I've heard. I read a news article about this. I need to find it again.
Oh, so on February 2nd, relatedly, a man who was born to U.S. citizens, so should be a United States citizen, was actually deported to Haiti, where he's not a citizen, after living in the U.S. for his entire life. So there was a big outcry on that, and that just happened 11 days ago.
And isn't he originally, or his family, from Saint Martin?
So his family's Haitian, his parents naturalized in the US, and then he was born in San Martin, but lived in the US for his entire life. And if you're born to two US citizens, you are supposed to be a citizen. So yeah, ICE is still up to their same shit that they were up to under Trump, deporting people wrongfully. Immigration activists have called for all the wrongfully deported people under Trump to actually be returned to the United States, but apparently that makes Biden uncomfortable. So.
And one of the things you mentioned earlier, I think it's called the Migrant Protection Protocol, which is what allows the asylum seekers to be left in Mexico. They haven't ended that protocol. You know, they said that they would no longer enroll people in it, but for whatever reason, that's still being kept around. So, children in cages still okay.
Yeah, and this is entirely contrary to international law. So the fact that Biden hasn't done anything to end it yet is really disheartening. He created a task force to review it. But while you're reviewing it, a lot of people are going to suffer who legitimately suffered persecution from their home governments. He also started a task force for the reunification for migrant families who are separated at the border under the Trump administration's policy. And again, activists have made the same claims that creating a task force is prolonging the problem. They should be focusing on the actual reunification instead of like talking about it for a few months while these families get harder and harder to reunify.
Well, it means it's easier for them, right? Less migrants that you have to unify in the first place.
Is it true? This is kind of like a tangent, but I do believe under the Obama administration, more people were deported than under Trump's administration. At least in 2019, I knew that was for a fact. I'm not sure about now. Maybe perhaps recently it's changed.
Yeah, I don't know how the numbers exactly stack up, but Obama was responsible for sharply ramping up deportations. Earlier on in his administration, it was particularly bad. And then he started enacting like slightly more humane immigration policies towards the end of his administration. So I'm not sure how the exact figures are between Obama and Trump, but activists nicknamed him like the deporter in chief during his tenure. So Obama is known amongst immigration advocates to have a particularly bad track record on this issue. And since we know Biden is just trying to get us back to the place where Obama is, that's not encouraging on this issue particularly.
That's how I was thinking.
Yeah, and I mean, historically, Democrats are horrible with regards to immigration. Bill Clinton was also a major deporter. You know, he also ramped up protection on the U.S.-Mexico border. I don't really have much faith that Biden's going to try and improve things so much as keep things quiet.
Could benefit from that. So I think if we can like look at that kind of like asylum seeking as an economic opportunity, which is obviously direly needed post-COVID, even during this time, I think that could be a way to potentially spin this in a piece of legislation that both like either definitely Democrats, perhaps even some Republicans could get on board with. I think as of right now, just like the current like, oh yeah, let's like let them in and like like reunify whatever it might be, seems to be like a and then what, right? There's that like and then what question hanging over everyone's heads in terms of like that. I think if we started with this is what we're going to do once we reunify, once we repatriate them, bring them to a community, whatever it might be, I think that could alleviate that conversation a bit more. But right now it just seems like a border scuffle, which I think at this stage, the like conservative way of thinking about it is like, just keep them out of the country. Like we have our own problems to deal with, whatever it might be, that like whole line of thinking, versus seeing it as an opportunity. I think it's more of like, because I think, economic opportunity is like the name of the game for Americans, right? Like, not humanity. Like, if we're saying that we're doing it for humanity's sake, I don't think they'll give a shit. If we say we're doing it for economic opportunity, I think they'll actually give a shit.
That's the capitalist system, baby.
Capitalism for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are two pieces of this that are really important that are left out of immigration discourses writ large. I think nationally, our conversation is kind of framed as like illegal immigrants and like the entitlements of being an American and how we shouldn't extend those to other people. But I think there are two important things that are left out of that conversation. So the first is the economic piece of the puzzle. So it is a well-documented fact that the US needs more migrants to join the workforce in order to be economically successful. We just do not have the labor amongst our population to do as they're called, like low skill jobs, even though I don't think personally, I don't think that's applicable to any job. I think any job requires a lot of work, particularly manual labor. But in terms of like our economic classifications for jobs, like low skilled labor, we do not have anyone in our country who is like born here really who's willing to do those jobs. Like we need migrants coming in all the time to do those jobs. And if we instead of forcing them to live in the shadows, we give them a path to citizenship for coming into our country. We provide support for them in terms of building community and like language services and stuff. And we actually regulate the industries. We won't see the labor exploitation that we see today. And our economy will grow greatly from their labor and from welcoming them into our country. I also think the other big piece of this is the history. So people talk a lot about how people from Latin and South America are constantly trying to stream over the US border. But the reason for that is that the United States government destabilized all the nations that people are coming from. We are directly responsible for undermining those governments and for the political instability that persists to this day. And people also talk a lot about public safety and gang violence, but the truth of the matter is that the biggest gangs in Latin America were actually started in the United States, in cities like Los Angeles, where extremely brutal police enforcement in communities of color led to the formation of gangs for protection. And then those gangs were later exported back to countries like Nicaragua and Honduras. So that's why gang violence is a big problem, because of our racist police force. So we are directly responsible for creating the problem, and we should be working with the countries that we destabilized to come up with solutions so everyone can live a more safe and healthy life.
Yeah, the US owes some major reparations to Latin America, at least with regards to free movement. If you just look up a map of US-backed coup attempts in Latin America, basically all of South America is lit up. You've got Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, El Salvador, and Costa Rica just in Central America. And another thing that I don't know if many people are aware, in 2012, the National Bureau of Economic Research put out a report stating, let me quote this, "The estimated gains from removing immigration restrictions are huge." There are massive potential economic gains from opening our borders, specifically in Latin America. There's so many very well-educated individuals who aren't able to operate in their own countries due to political issues. And we owe these nations to be able to help prepare them. And at the very least, we should allow these people to come into our nation and make it better.
Also, in terms of like the whole path to citizenship thing, I think, and even just thinking about my own parents, like I feel like most immigrants that I know of don't even necessarily want to stay in the United States. I think a part of them actually wants to be back home. They're here for economic opportunity, but ultimately this isn't their homeland. I think it could be interesting to have the individuals that are fleeing these countries be like in positions of power in the United States to help us solve the issues that are happening in those countries. They have a firsthand experience with the issues that are going on that are destabilizing that nation. We, of course, can work with that government to help them figure it out, but why not work with the individuals who are literally fleeing to our country, who like are here, that we can like draw from their knowledge and like their expertise of their localized area. Because once again, like it's like this issue with like a destabilizing community or a country, in the same way that like even the climate crisis, like these are localized issues. I'm sure the issues are localized city by city, town to town, region by region. So like having that like region, city, town level expertise of the individuals that are coming across our border, I think not only is there an economic benefit to them, you know, being part of our economy, but I think there's also like a security and like nation building like benefit to like having those people be part of the process of like healing the nation that they're coming from, in the effort to actually bring them back, right? To actually like not deport them to a country that is destabilized, but to like draw from their expertise to help them help their country so that they and their families can return back safely. Which is, you know, I think ultimate. And then while they're here, you know, like they can help turn our economic engine. Like I think both of those are like very clear opportunities that we have versus us like assuming what these countries need, right?
Yeah, I think the US overall needs to do a lot more listening, particularly when it comes to foreign policy in our own hemisphere, because our history has been very much telling other countries that we know what's best for them and that capitalism specifically is best for them. And undermining democratic processes in a lot of these nations and creating conditions where the government is unstable, the police force is involved in perpetrating crimes. And in a lot of these countries, one of the biggest problems is femicide. So they're just very, very unsafe to be a woman in any location at any point in time because the murder rates are so high.
So I want to be a little bit concerned, or I'm a little bit concerned about nation building as a concept.
Yeah.
But but that also brings to mind how China is bringing in a lot of foreign nationals, educating them, and then reaping the economic benefits from these individuals. You know, while they're in their country, but then also when they go back home, it also gives you political benefits. It helps you get closer to different nations. And if the U.S. is supposed to be the leader in the Americas, you know, in terms of innovation, it's vitally important, you know, that we partner with the countries around us to make a more equitable world in terms of climate change, in terms of our economic needs, and in terms of just social justice in general.
Absolutely. We need more partners and fewer nations that we look down upon.
Yeah. I think the same as what you were saying, Luis, like there's an economic benefit to feminism, social justice, to all of these things, to like general equality. It's like we don't have to treat it as we're giving them rights just because they're asking for it. Like let's give them rights because it actually benefits both of us to do so.
Man, China going full capitalist on it.
Right, that just kind of says it all, right? It's just.
But yeah, I mean, I think that argument really does
got
resonate with a lot of people.
Chuck Schumer,
it's not the most compelling argument to us, but in terms of like where America is at politically, I think the finances are really important to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So it looks like we are running out of time for this week's episode. Does anyone have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I got an email back from the founder of Fantasy Congress that she is going to find a way. Apparently there was some issue with JB Raskin and him not getting points for him crying. So I am going to get those points.
Capitalize off those tears.
Oh yeah. Give me those tear points. So I'm coming for number 1 and number 2.
You know, it's very telling that the person with the most points also happens to have one of the most conservative teams.
Oh yeah. And it's named Blue Dogs.
I think that wraps up our episode for this week. We will see you all back here next week while we break down what's going on in Congress.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, y'all.